Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for our first Curated Conversations at the Blanton. I'm Veronica Roberts. I'm curator of modern and contemporary art, but I have a very old laptop, so I was not able to do any cool backdrop. So you're getting my extremely old school book and card display behind me. I'm doing my best to shelter in place with Ellsworth Kelly. And we're so happy that you joined us tonight. I wanted to share a little bit about who will be joining me and then the format of tonight's Q&A. You can ask us any questions you have about Ellsworth Kelly's Austin. Tonight I'm joined by Carter Foster, our Deputy Director for Curatorial Affairs and Ellsworth Kelly Scholar Extraordinaire. If you saw the show that opened in tandem with the building in 2018, he curated that. And I'm also joined by Dalia Azim, who is our manager of special projects and a secret force behind a lot of the great things that happen at the Blanton. I was very lucky, Dalia and I were both very lucky to work with this Kelly studio on this project to help realize it and to be part of it from the beginning. And because this is a happy hour, I hope you are all, you've fixed your favorite drink and, or one of the options we suggested. We suggested French red wine because that's Ellsworth Kelly's favorite, but if you're drinking Italian or Californian, we won't tell and I'm sure he wouldn't mind. A little bit about the format. Your audio is muted, so I can't hear you right now, but there's a sort of if you kind of use your mouse at the bottom of the screen, you should see a section where you can join. You'll see a little Q&A button, and that's where you should feed us any questions you have. As panelists, we'll keep an eye on that and answer any questions that you have. The chat, we can also keep an eye on chat, but ideally put your questions in Q&A. And we'll be taking those from there. And then we'd also love to know if you've had a chance to visit the Ellsworth Kelly building yet. So raise your hands, there's a little way to raise your hand in the bottom screen just so we can see who's been there before. Trying to see. All right. Awesome. Great. And without further ado, here's Carter. He's going to kick it off with a little introduction to the building, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to start out with a little presentation about sort of the background of the building. Let me just share my screen. Hi, Jack, if you're there. All right, I'm going to start. This is a little weird doing this in the abstract, but an important point about Ellsworth, the building called Austin by Ellsworth Kelly, which was actually first conceived in the 1980s for a patron named Doug Kramer. But its roots really go back in his art a long way. He spent a formative period in France from 1948 to 1954. He had been to France as part of the, he was in the army, and he'd been to France earlier. And when he was eligible for the GI Bill back in the United States after he returned, he wanted to go back to France. And he spent 7 years there. And it was very formative for him. And he was, he considered himself a contemporary artist, of course, but he was interested in older art just as much as he was interested in newer art, contemporary art. And although he got to know famous artists like Alexander Calder and Constantine Brancusi, he also spent a lot of time going around France looking at sites. He was specifically interested in Romanesque and Cistercian architecture. And so I'm showing you a comparison of a postcard that I believe Ellsworth Kelly himself sent to someone of a church a Romanesque church in France and the exterior of the building Austin. And Romanesque art is known for its kind of clear forms and strong geometries, and Ellsworth Kelly is an artist who distills forms that he sees from nature and in the world. And Austin is very much a culmination of that act of distillation and his deep and long knowledge of the older art that he absorbed in France. And I'm going to show you a few more images. I love this image because it shows a church that Ellsworth Kelly saw, and it shows the role of stained glass in these churches. And of course, stained glass has a very natural spiritual function. Light passes through the colored glass into this sort of sacred space. And Kelly would have been looking at sort of the strong geometries that you see in the tracery, the work, the wire work and metal work that outlines the images in the stained glass. He was interested in those abstract shapes as much as he was interested in the stained glass itself and the images. And those kinds of things come back in Austin decades later when he's thinking about the function of the stained glass in the building, which is personally one of my favorite aspects of that building. This is a great comparison of, it shows two images of Ellsworth Kelly as a very young man working on art projects for the Army, doing sort of instructional posters. And then this is the first time he was in the Army and in France at the beginning. A very early drawing from 1944 when he was in France, and it shows you this interest in church and ecclesiastical architecture dates way back in his career. Then this is these two works. Well, the image on the left is a picture of him looking very bohemian in a hotel room on the Rue de Bourgogne, where he stayed when he went back to France, and a drawing that shows his very self-conscious awareness of himself as an artist and the tools of his trade. It's a self-portrait with himself in the mirror, but he doesn't show his face. He shows his hands, what he makes art with. And for those of you a lot of people don't think abstract artists can actually draw. This proves you wrong. And then I love this list that he made. This is a list that he owned till the end of his life, which is currently in his studio archive, of the museums and places that he wanted to see. So he did research and figured out, you can see there's if you can read it, there's a cave in there. He wanted to go that. The Louvre is there, the Bibliothèque Nationale, but also some other places that are sort of more on off the beaten path. I love, you can see Alice B. Toklas's collection. She had a famous collection she put together with Gertrude Stein that was on the kind of thing for people to see in Paris. But this fusion of old and new is what's really important to understand about the building Austin and Kelly's conception of it. And that's kind of encapsulated wonderfully in these two drawings, both early, both made from when he was in studying in France or living there. He would go to this place called the Byzantine Institute and copy images from old manuscripts. But in the work on the left, which is almost abstract, he's literally tracing the stonework in a church called Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, which is across the street from the Louvre, for those of you who've been to Paris. And you know, it looks like a modern abstract painting in a way. And this interest in stonework and how, you know, stone and architecture develops organically in these older systems of art, deeply interesting to him. And then he has this kind of Christian period where he is interested in sort of religious iconography and making his own work look old and kind of relate to an older time. So I'm showing you two works by Kelly on the left, Mother and Child and Lazarus. Lazarus was a saint that was famously revived by Jesus, and Mother and Child, it's not really necessarily a Madonna and Child, but of course it evokes that whole tradition. And the tonalities of these works are very kind of ruddy and look fresco-like. And he was looking at old frescoes, medieval frescoes in France, and I show you an example of one of those on the right. So I think you can see the similarities in tonality. So he's literally fusing an older type of art with a modern vocabulary. And that's like the crucial takeaway from all this. This is the image in the middle is a photograph the artist himself took of this church in Poitiers that he really liked. That shows his interest sort of in this type of architecture, but also details like the stonework. And you can see in this photograph in the center, the circular stonework at the top and the tympanum of this building. And he incorporates that into a painting that he did around the same time that he called Poitiers. And it's a very Picasso-esque type of painting, but he wanted to use the title of this place that had sort of an impact and inspiration on it. And that gets to him this long tradition in his work of titling works after places that they're either intended for or related to. And I think you can figure out where that's going. Finally, I just wanted to end with this image of a very abstract painting, but that's taken from an element called a mandorla in a church, this sort of almond-shaped form that interested him so much, coming again out of an older tradition and him translating it into a very modern, rigorous, abstract vocabulary. And that's sort of the old background for how Austin develops. It's a project that germinated for many years. As I mentioned earlier, it was first done in the 1980s and first conceived in the 1980s. And then it ended up in Austin many decades later for a number of reasons, which you're free to ask about, and we can answer sort of any question you might have, hopefully. So now I'm going to stop sharing and we'll go to the questions if we have any.
Awesome. Carter, did you say how long, just before we answer other people's questions, did you say how long he was in France, or could you share a little?
Yeah, 7 years from 1948 to 54. I think roughly 7 years, yeah.
And did he speak French?
He learned to speak some French, yeah. I don't know that if he was really fluent. I think he was pretty fluent when he was, by the end of his time there, for sure. And there's a wonderful film that was made about his time in France in which he goes back to visit some of these places, and people are, he's speaking to them in French. You know, you can see him riding his bike around. That's sweet.
All right, I have the first question for the group, which is, you mentioned that Ellsworth went through I think this is a good one for Carter. You mentioned Ellsworth went through a Christian period, but was he religious?
He was not religious. He was spiritual. I think he valued the spirituality that art can convey. But he was definitely not a Christian and not really religious. I think nature was his religion. He loved the natural world. He was a bird watcher his whole life. He loved plant forms and had a ongoing series of plant drawings that he did. And there's a phrase that someone very close to him used. I think he said it was I can't remember the phrase, but anyway, he wasn't Christian and he wasn't religious, but he deeply understood these traditional religious forms and the way that religion informs the history of art. I mean, that he deeply, deeply understood.
And I have a question for Dalia. This is from Thomas. Can you talk about the construction process a bit?
Sure. I think I used to have the whole schedule memorized, but I think it took about 18 months from the time we broke ground until we opened in February 2018. It was done obviously on the grounds of the Blanton. We were open the whole time, but yeah, we basically had a construction site and we're able to see it come together very beautifully, like from the steel to the stone to installing the glass at the end. But we worked with some local firms to get it built.
Great. And then this is a great question from Lucia, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
She's my neighbor across the street.
Oh, she said, is Austin one of the reasons that Carter came to the Blanton?
Well, it sort of is in a way. I mean, it's not, I wrote about the building in 2010 for a show called Ellsworth Kelly Black and White. And I worked with Ellsworth about writing that essay. And that's when I first became aware of the project. But that was not long before, but that was before it was ever going to be built. But that, the building was sort of being shopped around to places by a guy named Hiram Butler. I don't know if shopped around is the right word, but this guy named Hiram Butler, a great gallerist in Houston, was promoting the building of the building and thought someone in Texas might do it. And he was right. Our director, Simone Witche, and one of our trustees, Jeannie Klein, took it to the president of UT. And so it ended up being built. And I was asked by Veronica to come be on a panel. And one thing led to another, and I ended up working here. So, I mean, I sort of came here because of the building first and ended up working here. Certainly it was important to me. The project was deeply important and personal to me because I knew Ellsworth and had written about it. And I also thought it was an amazing work of art.
Carter, I still remember the dinner that we had that Jack hosted at the steakhouse in downtown Austin after the talk. And I just had this good feeling that this was somehow you were going to come to the Blanton. So, all right. So we also have a question from Rachel.
Can we have you answer a question?
Sure. Go for it.
So also kind of connected to Carter's answer. Can you talk about your favorite memory of working with Ellsworth Kelly on the project? I know that it's one of the first things you did once you joined the Blanton was go to his studio.
Yes, and here I thought I had just moved to Austin in February, and I was so excited to not be in New York in February, and then I went to the studio so immediately, and of course, like every time I went to the studio, it seemed to be February or March, and it was freezing and snowy, but those were such amazing trips and experiences, and my most vivid memory is Ellsworth in a puffy jacket, Jacqueline from the Matthew Marks Gallery, Jack Shear, his partner, all of us huddled in one of his studios that his assistants in Spencertown in upstate New York, and huddled around one of they had these sort of doors that they had rigged to show window samples and glass samples. And I think one of the most fascinating things to watch was this master of color try to figure out how to translate color in glass and light, and trying to get the stained glass color right. And I could see that it was both daunting a little bit for him, but also an incredible opportunity that he was game for. And so what would happen is these samples would be shipped in from Germany, and all the stained glass was made in Germany, and it was and we would often combine panels, but again, it was in February in the freezing cold. We were all dressed, you know, in gloves and mittens and scarves, looking at these samples in the studio, trying to get the color right. And Ellsworth would say things like, you know, this purple isn't quite right. We've got to try. Let's try it with a little more red, and then, you know, we would try and try again. So that was an amazing experience.
By the way, something fascinating about the way he worked that I got to see too was it was just total instinct with him. He wasn't following systems. He wasn't conceptual in that way. He was just, it was all instinct in how he thought something looked and whether it felt and looked right to him. And I had a moment when I was looking at something with him and I realized I could only see the difference in the two colors he was showing me when he pointed them out. And I realized he could just see things I wasn't capable of seeing, really. And it was just really interesting. And it makes you realize, like, people have special abilities that you.
There is one question, Carter, you could maybe continue talking about that. Can you talk about what inspired the color and the design of the stained glass?
Yeah, so I mean, the stained glass, well, what we call the tumbling squares, which you see behind me, which is totally fake. I'm not sitting in the building, someone asked that. I'm in my house, but the tumbling squares windows and the window across from that, which we call the sort of starburst window, those are both spectrums, meaning they're gradations of color that follow, you know, go through a sequence and come back to the lightest color. And that's a motif that he used his whole career and developed it in many different forms, often with vertical bars that go from light to dark to back to light again. So what was the question? Sorry, what inspired the windows? Is that what you said?
Yeah.
So he applied that spectrum idea to two of the windows. The window behind me is the only window in the building that actually has direct inspiration, and it comes from one of the rose windows in Chartres Cathedral, which has this motif in it. It's the north rose window of Chartres. So you can go online after this and look at it and you'll see those motifs. And he was fascinated by what he called these tumbling squares. And he thought it looked so modern. And there's a great quote by him where he says, "I couldn't believe someone from the 13th century could do that. It just seems so modern, and the way they look like they're moving." So that came directly from, you know, a specific source. The spectrum is something that he came up with himself, but of course it's something we know from science and nature, a rainbow, the color spectrum, and various color system theories. And then the color grid in the front of the building, that's also a motif that he had used many times in his career, starting very early on. And he was in, I just lost my train of thought when you switched the image, sorry. The
color in school, were you thinking of color spectrum in school or no?
The color grid was just something he had used a lot. And the grid itself was, of course, a really important trope in modernist painting, and one that he specifically was using to kind of remove the idea of composition from the work. I mean, there's the whole book's written on the grid, but his use of color and the grid is something that dates way back into his work. So all of the windows have deep roots in his whole career. And you can read about it in this book that's coming out, that's just now out, published by the Blanton and Radius Books, where we go through these motifs. So you can go on Amazon afterwards and buy it.
Since our store is sadly closed.
Plug for the book.
Yeah. So one of the questions that Rachel asked, that we get asked, I'd say that's one of the most commonly asked questions, is about the paintings inside. Because if you're inside, you don't know, they look like paintings, and they're not actually. They're marble panels. So Dalia, do you want to talk a little bit about where they're from and the materials and sort of what they're loosely based on?
Sure. Well, I think Carter can take the last part, but in terms of sourcing the material, it's made of black and white marble. And they're sourced, the white was from Carrara, from a section of a quarry in Carrara where Michelangelo was known to have sourced a lot of his white marble. And then the black was, came from a quarry in Belgium. But they were put together by a group called Baker Carlson Arts in California, who Kelly worked with for like 35 years, I believe. And they're Stations of the Cross, which maybe Carter can speak to in more depth. But if you actually start at the first one on your left when you enter and go around, it's all of the Stations of the Cross in a very abstracted, minimal way.
So this attests to his deep interest in religious architecture and religious iconography, even though he wasn't a Christian himself. And of course, the Stations of the Cross, for those of you who know modern art, there's a famous series of abstract black and white paintings by Barnett Newman in the National Gallery in Washington. That's an important precedent. But Matisse himself also did a chapel with Stations of the Cross that are figurative and not abstract, but they are in black and white. So this sort of idea of working serially, I think, which was really interesting to Ellsworth Kelly. It was for a building with this type of form, the Stations of the Cross provided the perfect sort of conceit for coming up with a serial group of works. They do actually relate formally in terms although they're abstract, the Stations of the Cross traditionally in art history, the cross itself is a diagonal or a vertical, or it has a strong compositional element in that series of subjects, and Ellsworth Kelly very much played on that. So yeah, they're really interesting for that reason. We have lots of questions.
We do. There's what to choose. There's a lot of good questions.
I can talk about why it ended up in Austin, because that's, I'd say, the other question that we get asked maybe the most. And I should say that during the process of working with Ellsworth, he was involved in every single decision. He chose the site. He designed everything, I think, except for maybe the exit sign and the benches. So he was really integral to everything and involved in everything, but he actually never came to Austin. And he had a health issue that prevented him from getting on airplanes. Now we're all not doing that anyway. But the reason that it came to Austin is that Carter mentioned a Houston gallerist named Hiram Butler. And Hiram was visiting the studio and had read Carter's essay about the project and asked Ellsworth about this amazing chapel that he had designed in the 1980s and said, would you hope to see this realized? And of course, Ellsworth was interested, and Hiram, although he did not in any way represent the artist, he is a UT alum. And so he was excited about, and he's a gallerist in Houston. So he brought it to Jeannie and Mickey Klein and to the University of Texas. And now that I know more about what it means to work for a university and the staggering, soul-crushing bureaucracy, I think it is truly a miracle that we, and it really took incredible leadership from the former president, Bill Powers, who is one of my heroes, and Simone and the whole team and Jack Shear and everyone, but and the donors who helped us. But it's kind of amazing. I mean, he didn't get to see it fully constructed, but when he passed away, construction had already begun, and he knew that it was going to be here. And he was really excited that it was such a young and vibrant city. And he chose the location. He wanted it near the Blanton, but he also really liked that it was near, the Capitol, and that it was not tucked away and something that you'd have to look at a map to find. And I think he chose the tumbling squares, that window. It gets the best light of the three of them. It really gets the most beautiful light. And I think that was a window that was particularly important to him. So he really thought about all of these decisions, but that's how it came to Austin, and we're so lucky and grateful for that.
There's a related question from John Carlos Estrada of CBS Austin. He said, did Kelly make any tweaks to adjust to the Texas climate? I mean, he did. Simone, our director, told a funny story of him asking why it needs air conditioning, which if you live here,
you wouldn't ask.
But it was originally designed for a California climate as a much simpler building. So it had to have, of course, robust security and HVAC equipment. And so the walls got thicker, and the exterior, when it was conceived for the 1980s, it was conceived as a kind of stucco, like Mediterranean type exterior, and also being cast concrete. All of that changed. And he really got into the stone and the stonework. And once he sort of switched to the idea of using stone, he went back to sort of the Romanesque architecture that inspired him and interpreted that in a much more modern way. But so those adjustments were definitely made for the Texas climate. And of course, we do have some extreme weather here, both in terms of storms, hail, and just temperature extremes, especially heat. So yeah, all those were definitely taken into consideration. But what's really interesting is that if you look at the older models, the concept didn't change. I mean, the concept, composition, everything was there that was there in the 1980s.
Absolutely. And we left off the very first question from Maggie, and maybe Carter can answer this, which is, did Kelly go to school to study art history, or architecture?
He studied art at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He studied art specifically. He studied with, I think, there's a painting in the Blanton collection, which you can't see right now, by Carl, what's his name? The screen.
I know. Oh, not Zagrosser. Oh my gosh, I just blanked too.
Selba, I think. He was a teacher of Ellsworth's. So there was German expressionism was very much in the air, but yeah, he did study he got a degree, as far as I know.
But Paris was really his instructor in a lot of ways, as Carter mentioned before, and he studied in Paris on the GI Bill. My grandfather also was on the GI Bill. I feel like that whole generation, so many of them had amazing experiences, and those nearly 7 years that he spent in Paris were as much of an education as anything else.
Okay. Do the colors have specific names? That's a really interesting question to me, because I think when people look at Ellsworth's art altogether, sometimes people think it looks sort of repetitive, like he's doing the same thing over and over again. And I think it's really insignificant that he never repeated colors in his work. He always mixed, like when he was making a painting, he would mix the color for that painting. And so he did, as far as I know, he didn't give names to colors like you get in like the J. Crew catalog, like, whatever, heather green or whatever. So he used the normal names for colors, but of course he was deeply aware of the infinite subtleties that can go on in the gradations of colors.
There's a question from James about how the light in the window changes throughout the year, which is like personally my favorite aspect of the whole building, is just trying to understand that and just experience it. And we have the benefit of getting to do that since we work there every day. But it changes pretty drastically from season to season, and it's really kind of amazing to watch it shift.
And that connection to nature, the fact that it is tied to the changing seasons and to the sun specifically, and it's like a time-based work, that changes throughout the year. I mean, I think he designed it to be that. There's a wonderful time lapse that we had done when it opened that you can probably find online that shows like the light moving through it.
I remember when my nephews visited for the first time, and they loved standing in the refracted light that came through the tumbling squares. And then one thing that they noticed that I hadn't paid as close attention to, but now I always notice, is even the black and white marble panels, they sort of have, they'll sometimes glow. The edges will have like a purple meeting a green or an orange meeting a pink. You'll get these really beautiful light effects on the edges because he made them come off the wall. They're not flush to the wall. There's a little bit of depth. And so the light, what Dalia was saying about the light, it's not just the windows. It's on the floor. It's behind the panels. It's really amazing. And I also love the way on a gray day you walk in and it's kind of dark and everything's black and white. And it's not until you go towards the totem and turn around or turn to the right or left that you see any color. So it's this very dramatic moment because you're walking in and you're seeing a brown wood totem and black and white panels. It's kind of amazing.
There are a couple questions, maybe one of you can answer, maybe Carter, that get to the religious question. Thomas says that it's cathedral-esque. Can you talk more about the meaning and purpose, the inspiration for that form? And then Tammy Rubin had asked too, do you think personally and philosophically that art can function in any way like religion?
I mean, I think that's a question that everyone has to answer for themselves. For me personally, the answer is absolutely yes. Yeah. And I think that, Kelly was certainly aware of the spiritual nature of this. He's creating a form that historically is tied to a very specific form of spirituality, Catholicism, or Christian religion, and more broadly Judeo-Christian tradition. So he's nodding to that subject matter by using the forms that he used. He's just not using them in a really specific way. So I mean, I find that relationship between abstract art and religion quite interesting. And in fact, my former boss, Adam Weinberg, director of the Whitney Museum, he's writing a book about modern chapels, like chapels designed by modern artists. And he was inspired by when he came here for the opening of this. That's what gave him the idea for the book. So he'll have a whole book devoted to that. What was the other question was? I mean, the building it's what we call a Latin cross. It's in the shape of a cross. Latin cross meaning the transept arms are shorter than the nave. So he's just taking this very basic form of ecclesiastical architecture and translating in a modern idiom. But and then everything in it, from the Stations of the Cross to the placement of the totem. The totem is wood. It's long and tall like a cross, and it takes the place. That's where a cross would be in a church. He was of course, aware of all that. And someone asked earlier about the meaning of the totem, which I find, it's a great question. The totem is fascinating because it's become the most touched object in our museum, and please tell people not to touch it. But for some reason, people are really drawn to it and really attracted to it. And I think that because it has this kind of focus when you go in, it's like the focal point of the whole interior composition in a way. And it's the first thing you see, and it's at the end of a long perspective. Meaning-wise, I mean, it takes the plate, it sits where a cross would sit, so it has meaning related to that. But like the whole building, it doesn't have meaning specifically. The meaning is what you bring to it. He used that form that he called totems from early in his career in the early 1970s. He started doing a series called Curves. And this is a version of that series. And he did read them. He did read those forms anthropomorphically. He thought they referenced the human body. And of course, referencing the human body as it does, it makes you think of the body of Christ and the way the cross references the body in Christian iconography.
It's funny, when I look at the totem, which I think is so beautiful, it was emotionally really moving when the totem got installed and anchored into the ground. And I think part of it is the texture of the redwood. I mean, redwood is such a beautiful material and color, and you see the grain of the wood. But for me, as a bird watcher, like Ellsworth Kelly was, I also look at it, and he had such an amazingly precise vision, as Carter mentioned. And the tapered curve reminds me of, like, if you're a bird watcher, you can recognize a bird from the shape of the bill. You don't even need to see what color it is. You know from the shape of the bill what kind of shorebird it is. It's a long-billed curlew, or it's this. And I just feel like that incredible sensitivity to line and contour comes from, as Carter mentioned, the natural world. Thomas also someone asked about the Rothko Chapel in Houston, and we get that question also quite a bit, like whether he was maybe inspired or saw it. But I think that he really wasn't looking actually at the Rothko Chapel. Hilariously, a curator who shall remain nameless, when we opened the building, he worked at the Manila at the time, and he called me and he said, "We get gloom and doom and you get joy and light, no fair." They have very different sensibilities.
Totally different. I mean, they really are in the terms of the way you feel and stuff.
Yeah. So I think there's a larger history, certainly, that he was part of in terms of artist designed, ecclesiastical but non-denominational spaces, inspired by these sort of chapel histories. But to me, it's the Matisse Chapel in France that feels a little bit more simpatico in terms of, but it's ultimately quite different, because it's ultimately quite different from both of those in that he designed every single part of it. It was like, he designed the architecture, he designed the windows, everything.
That's a key difference. That's a really key difference, yeah.
Yeah.
The history of the Rothko Chapel, Rothko and Johnson the architect were fighting with each other, basically.
Yeah, and there was no fighting here. Yeah.
So James says, Austin versus Rothko Chapel death match. Well, we know who wins, come on.
We know who wins, sorry. That one's not even a fair competition. Liz has a question. Liz says, I live near campus and have been building up my kids' biking stamina to be able to ride to the Austin. Would you tell them, if you had 30 seconds to tell them about Austin, because that's about their attention span. Sorry, let me get the rest of your question. What would you tell them if you had 30 seconds to tell them about Austin, because that's their attention span?
Take a deep breath and be quiet for the next 30 seconds.
Yeah, I would let them look. I would let them look, yeah. I don't think it's interesting. I feel like abstract art can sometimes be very intimidating to people, but I haven't felt that people are intimidated by this building.
Also because the building's not abstract, so when you have abstract art in a building, it's a little bit different. It acts like decoration in the best possible sense.
I can say that, I don't know how old your kids are, Liz, but my nephews were so obsessed and loved it and wanted to come back, and they were showing me things. So I don't know what you can tell them. They will probably tell you some things.
Jennifer asks about whether we can show early drawings of the building.
Yeah, I have some. If I can do my screen share again, let me try.
Yeah, and it's also another plug for our book. There's in the Blanton's book on the Kelly, there's a lot there too. But yeah.
So let's see. Can you guys see it? Is it coming up?
The model?
There we go. This is not my screen, so I can't control this, sorry. I was gonna show mine.
So Carter, remind us whether he built this model or did drawings first?
He did, hold on. he did make drawings. He did these very schematic drawings, which I would show you if I could share my screen. Maybe I can show the book. Can I share my screen now?
Yeah, maybe find the page first, since you're like, it looks like a hologram.
Hold on, it'd be better if I can show. I'm just gonna try. Hold on.
While Carter's looking, someone asked if the university leadership, if it was hard to get this through, you know, the design standards for buildings at UT. And like, I just wanted to answer that question and just say, if we hadn't had a president at the time who was so believed in the project and got it from the very beginning, it actually was relatively smooth sailing, because there were so many people who were such champions of this project and understood its value.
Can you see the drawings now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is
so these are some early drawings. You can see this is like the one on the right is like I think the earliest drawing we know of. And what's fascinating is you can see the concepts all there. I mean, he has the building, the Latin cross plan. He has the proportions he was thinking of worked out. He's numbered this, but it's very schematic. And then on the left, you see an early drawing for the color grid in the front, and then the starburst window. And what's so fascinating is how much it looks like these drawings of, sorry, it's funny to show you that. Drawings of mandorlas that he did in his time in France, and how close that form is to this radiating light. And then he pretty quickly gets into these very precise technical drawings where he's trying to convey the concept to an architect. He knew that these drawings were going to be sent to an architect to be realized in blueprint form, which they in fact were. And if you know the building really well, you can see the difference in proportion from these early drawings, how much lower to the ground the windows are, but you can see the tumbling square window, I think. And you can see that he didn't, this is before the Stations of the Cross were conceived for the interior. He has his own sculpture and his own art in these schematic drawings. And then here's another early drawing for the facade, which didn't, you know, that window ended up going on one of the transept facades, but you can see him using a Xerox, like he Xeroxed the drawing and then made color notation. So the work on the right is a combination of a sort of a Xerox thing and his own hand. And then this is the early model, which the Jack Shearer ended up giving us, the Kelly Studio ended up giving us, and then this very precise sort of drawing that he sent to architects, and you can see the Stations of the Cross in that drawing as well, I think. Okay, stop sharing.
Should we put Carter back on the spot and ask him to talk about his tattoo and the relationship to the design?
Yes.
There's not really, I mean, the relation, so I have a tattoo that he designed. Can you see it? I don't know. Which he did in 2010. And, you know, this relates to a series of works, multi-panel works and prints that he did, which he'd been doing his whole career, basically. Of course, it looks sort of like the tumbling squares, but in fact, none of the forms on my tattoo are square. They're all irregular. What's the term? Polyhedrons? I don't know. Four-sided things are not square.
Polygons?
No. Polygons. Yeah, I don't know. I'm bad at math. But you know, the windows are actually squares, so they're they're different type of geometry than my arm tattoo. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Rectangles, that's what Carlotta says. Yeah, they're rectangles. Well, they're not rectangles on my arm. There is a word for that, geometrically. Parallelogram, thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for the assist. Liz McPhail, thank you.
We have a question about the inside being echoey like a church. Was there ever any kind of sound baffling considered? Which I can speak to. We did these acoustic studies actually when we were in that process of figuring out the design with Kelly, and we knew that it would have that sound quality, and I think to him it was reminiscent of these old churches and cathedrals, and so no, there wasn't a thought of adding baffling or trying to dampen that sort of echoiness in any way.
We did have, I was fortunate to experience one musical event in the building, and the building wasn't planned for performances or anything like that, but a couple of years ago, a jazz musician that played with Wynton Marsalis was in town. He's friends with our director. I can't remember his name, but he's a pretty well-known jazz musician, and he came and brought his clarinet, and he played his clarinet in the building, and it really, really sounded amazing. I mean, it was incredible. So acoustically, it works for music if we ever decide to go down that road. And I don't think Kelly was opposed to that. It just, you know, we'd have to decide if we want to use it for music at some point, but it doesn't really, wasn't made for functions. Okay.
I think we have 5 more minutes. And oh, I love that one of our frequent questioners is identifying his location as Athens, Georgia. So
Where was the college?
I love it. Is Austin a work of architecture with art in it, or a collection of paintings housed in a work of architecture? That is such a good question. This is like a riddle wrapped in an enigma. And by the way, try to write a press release about this. Like, how do you refer to this? Because if you talk about Austin as a building, that's not, it is a building. You can walk into it, but that's obviously not enough. It's a work of art that's also a building. So I definitely don't think of it as a collection of paintings housed in a work of architecture. There's a German term that I actually think is really useful. It's, forgive my pronunciation, it's called Gesamtkunstwerk, and it means like a total work of art, and it basically means a complete art experience where the structure and everything in it is a single work of art. And so we would, for example, never remove the black and white marble panels and put Ellsworth Kelly. You know, we got this question occasionally in the beginning, like, oh, will there be rotating shows inside? No, this is a work of art. It's a building. In the same way that perhaps Egyptian pyramids, you know, those are works of art and they're structures, but they're works of art. So if
I was an art historian coming from, you know, objectively from, I would just call it, it's a work of architecture that, I mean, it's decorated with art, but it's like, you know, it's no different than a cathedral in that sense, to me. But it was conceived as a totality by one artist not to ever change.
Yeah. It defies classification, honestly, and that's kind of the beauty of it. And let's see, were there any questions that we missed? Somebody asked about Kelly Green, but I'm not sure. Mark, you need to elaborate.
Someone asked to spell this out.
Relationship to whether the colors had names.
They don't have names. No.
Yeah.
I do want to say one thing about the color, though. One of the things that I am really struck by is the way that yellow is at the top of all 3 of the windows. It's in the center position of the 9-square grid. It's in the center of the top of the tumbling squares. And when you think about spectrums of color, you often think about a rainbow going from red to violet. And as Carter said, that's not what his spectrums do. But I remember asking him at the studio at one point why yellow was always in the first spot or the top spot. And he said that yellow is the sun and light is life. And I thought that was really beautiful. So I think we should have a toast to Ellsworth Kelly and all of you and your wonderful questions. So whatever glass you have or beverage, please let's raise a glass to Ellsworth Kelly. And thank you all for joining us for our first curated conversation. And I'm gonna let Dalia close us out here.
Yes, like Veronica said, thank you so much for coming to the first one of these. We're going to be putting a survey up on the screen right now about tonight's program. You can either answer it or opt out. And before you leave, we'll also share a few links. For more about Austin by Ellsworth Kelly, please visit kelly@theblanton.org, where you'll find an essay that Carter wrote with plenty of imagery, plus a series of behind-the-scenes videos about the creation of Austin. And if you're not a member, please consider joining for special perks and to support the museum at blantonmuseum.org/membership. Or if you'd just like to subscribe to our email newsletter for info about upcoming programs and other news, you can do that at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe. And finally, if you have topics you'd like to see us cover in future programs, just drop us a line at info@blantonmuseum.org. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.